Welcome to the CHCH Newsmakers podcast. I'm your host, Rick Zamperin. If it's making news in Hamilton, Halton, and Niagara, across Canada or around the world, we are tackling it here on Newsmakers. September 30th is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. It's a time to honor the lost children and survivors of residential schools, their families, and communities. It also provides us with a reminder to recognize the resilience of Indigenous peoples. Joining us today to speak about reconciliation is Dr. Vanessa Watts, Associate Professor and Acting Chair of Indigenous Studies at McMaster University. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
This is obviously a special day. What does Truth and Reconciliation Day mean for you?
Well, it's interesting. When you said in your intro it's about resilience, I would say yes, it's about resilience. It's also about remembering and making space for survivors and their families to share their stories in whatever way they can and choose to. And it's also about, I suppose, creating a moment for reminder for all Canadians that this is not a past issue. This is something that is still alive today, that Indigenous communities are still dealing with the impacts of the Indian residential school system. And so in order to get towards that notion of resilience, there's still a lot of work to do, and it's not in isolation from other Canadians.
What are the different ways we can recognize the day? What should Canadians be doing?
They should be reading. They can be watching documentaries. You know, for our local Hamiltonians, the Woodland Cultural Centre is opening its the Mohawk Institute, which is a museum of the former Indian residential school, the Mohawk Institute. And so people will be going to that to learn, to hear from survivors. So if there's a chance for you to get out and listen to stories from survivors, I think that's a really important way to honor the day, is to recognize them and to listen to what they have to say. It's
that particular institute's being called the Museum of Conscience, and the first of its kind in Canada, and maybe even the world. That's an important place.
It really is, and it was the longest running residential school in Canada, the first residential school in Canada. Not a lot of people know that, and it's one of the only buildings that's left standing in Canada.
Yeah. This December, it's hard to believe, marks 10 years for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to, reveal its calls of action. 94 of them, yet only 12 or 13 have been fully implemented. Right. That's got to be somewhat disturbing, or really disturbing, really.
It is. It's been 10 years. I think a lot of Indigenous communities and Canadians, too, would have hoped that more would have been achieved at this stage. And we're talking about really important areas like child welfare, the justice system, health. There's still these huge disparities in Indigenous communities that are effects of the system in which First Nations were impacted through the Indian Act, and we still continue to be impacted by the Indian Act and jurisdictional issues that we face. And so those things have not yet been addressed in the way that they should. And those calls to action give clear instructions. This is what needs to happen. So these delays that keep happening, right, are still impacting Indigenous communities, and the calls to action keep seeming kind of further and further away. Yeah.
And so why is that? You mentioned jurisdictional issues, the Indian Act. What is the holdup? Many Canadians, especially, Indigenous peoples, are thinking, why are we not getting to where we need to be?
Well, the Indian Act is still in place, right? The Indian Act is one of the oldest pieces of legislation in Canada in 1876, right? So that's only, 9 years after Canada's Confederation, right? And those jurisdictional issues and problems of child welfare belongs to the province, but First Nations on reserve are federal jurisdiction. There's still issues in terms of funding, equitable funding for child welfare systems. Access to health care is still an issue on reserve and off reserve when Indigenous peoples can face racism within the healthcare system. So this continues, even though there's been this national imperative and call to draw attention to these issues. In some ways, some issues have gotten worse, and we start to see that more and more recently with things like Indian residential school denialism, where there are people in the public who saying, oh, well, they weren't that bad. Right. People are exaggerating. So even after all of this effort and education, there seems to be this emergence, right, of this this more polarized view that they just weren't that bad, actually.
And where's that coming from, that denialism, which is not to say that this never happened, but they're downplaying the significance of it?
I don't know. I think part of it could be rhetoric coming in from the States about that this isn't a big deal. We don't want to talk about race. We don't, the history is in the past. But the calls to action aren't calls to a guilty conscience, right? It's not about making Canadians feel bad and therefore this sort of whiplash response of, well, it wasn't that big of a deal. The calls were not intended to do that. The calls were about educating and addressing the direct impacts of the Indian residential school system. So in terms of that denialism, I think some people from that sort of view might be tired of hearing about reconciliation, but we're barely getting to the truth. The truth is still happening. It's still coming out. It's very difficult to imagine reconciliation without first having really truthful conversations. And so denialism is a way to sort of shut down that conversation on truth.
And the TRC wasn't a gotcha document, right?
No.
Like we've proven what happened, and now this is an effort to make things better.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, even for survivors to access a common experience payment, would have to go through a very long application, would have to detail things that happened to them. The Canadian government hired and had legal staff and investigators on staff that would investigate these claims. It wasn't just, well, whatever you say, that's what goes. They were very much looking at archival records data within doctors' offices, working with therapists. Did this person go through therapy? I mean, this was a very complicated, arduous process for survivors. It certainly cannot amount to a gotcha moment.
And they're still going through this process. I mean, it didn't end when the Truth and Reconciliation report came out or the calls of action came out. They're living through, in many respects, a lot of pain, knowing what happened or going through what happened.
Yeah, and some choose not to talk about their experience, right? And so those who did come forward, that's how they chose to talk about and to perhaps go through a healing process. And some have still not chosen to, and that's okay too.
Indigenous Studies at McMaster University. Give us a scope of what's being taught and how effective it's been and what students are taking away from it.
Yeah, so we just actually launched our master's program. We're in our second year, and that's been really exciting. We've doubled our cohort, but we've been around since 1989 when we were just a couple of courses on the books, and now we're a fully fledged honors undergraduate program with a master's program. We have one of the biggest Indigenous Studies departments in Canada with 11 faculty, and our numbers are growing. So students can focus on language, they can focus on Indigenous health, gender. There's definitely opportunities for land-based learning within our programming, and they have opportunities not to just learn from full-time faculty, but from experts within the community, whether they're from Six Nations or local here to Hamilton, who come in and share that knowledge. So I would say they have a really, really diverse array of opportunities.
One of the things you mentioned was language, and there have been some languages that have been lost or are close to being lost. How important is that program, and how popular is that program among students?
I mean, I think it's so important. So we offer 3 courses, Mohawk, Cayuga, and Ojibwe. And Six Nations Polytechnic also has really excellent language programming. So when we have students come from Six Nations Polytechnic, they're also contributing to what we're able to offer and share with our own students. They're very popular courses. With our continued sort of efforts, we want to expand that. Right now, they're first and second year courses, but to try to increase not only the number of languages, but the sort of lifelong journey within the program. Can we get it up to 4th year, right? And so that's going to take some time, but they're absolutely very popular with the students. Yep.
What kind of careers are students thinking of when they're entering the Indigenous Studies program?
So a lot of our students, they go into law, they can go into medicine, some double major with political science or sociology or anthropology. They'll go back and work within their own Indigenous communities or NGOs. Some of them go to work on as public servants within the Canadian or provincial government. So there's a lot of opportunities, but law is increasingly interesting, within our student population.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And given the times, that could be a very impactful career as well.
I think so. Yep, absolutely.
And it sounds like the program has grown since '89 tremendously.
Yeah, Yes.
That's a positive sign.
Very much.
Your project, Reneighboring as Reconciliation. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so Reneighboring as Reconciliation is a way in which to bring Inuit communities and Haudenosaunee communities kind of back together as neighbors. And so when were they neighbors? Well, they were neighbors in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s when Inuit were brought down for treatment of tuberculosis here to Hamilton at the Hamilton Mountain Sanatorium. And at the same time, the Mohawk Institute was still operating and running, removing children and having them stay there in Brantford, but really on Six Nations land during the 1950s and 60s. So, just 30 to 40 kilometers apart, we had communities that were really, really close together, who are normally thousands of kilometers apart and not really getting to engage with each other on their own terms, but sort of institutionalized, right, in different ways. Right. And so what would it be like to think about bringing these communities back together and having them actually engage on their own terms? So there's quite a few different aspects to this. The archival piece is really important because here in Hamilton, the Hamilton Health Sciences Association owns the most of the archival records from the Hamilton Mountain Sanatorium, or the SAN as it's called. And so myself and other researchers right now on our team are working with McMaster and the Hamilton Health Sciences Association to try to have access, get increased access out there. Yep.
So what is the end goal? What is going to be, I guess, the prize at the end of the finish line?
Well, one of the prizes I think would be ensuring that the archival documents that are housed here in Hamilton are accessible to Inuit communities and organizations. Right now they're restricted. And so we as researchers have access to them, but we need to, we're trying to help facilitate increased and open access to Inuit communities, especially those who were actually here in Hamilton in the 50s and 60s who are still living or whose family is living and they want to know more information about what happened to their family members. Another goal would be to bring Inuit down to the Indigenous Studies Department here at McMaster and have our students go up to Nunavut, and we're going to be having a cultural exchange, and they'll be earning credit for that. And another piece I think that's really important is the art. So while at the SAN, Inuit patients were given soapstone, and as a form of occupational therapy, they were encouraged to create carvings. And these carvings would be sold at the hospital gift shop. Some of those proceeds would go to the patients, and then some would go to the hospital. And so there is a collection of just over 100 pieces at the Art Gallery of Hamilton called the Chidok Art Collection. And so we will be also exhibiting these pieces and traveling them to Nunavut in the next 2 years so that the communities can see these carvings, and they'll also be exhibited at Woodland.
Wow. That must be powerful, especially the cultural exchange. My brother has been to the Arctic a couple of times through his work, and just, interacting with the people up there, seeing, their history through what has been done over generations, he found to have a very positive reaction to it. I can only imagine those who are in Indigenous studies and how they would react to it. Yeah,
because I think also there's these assumptions that Indigenous people are all the same, right? Inuit and First Nations and Métis are distinct. And then even within those groups, we have a huge diversity, right? And so it's also a way for us to get to know each other, who we are, why we're different, and why we're the same in some ways. And I think when you spoke about resilience at the beginning, this is a really important feature of that. It's not just about learning about trauma and harm that happened within our own communities, which it did, but also about how our cultural ways of knowing, our Indigenous knowledge systems are still intact, and that we want to share them with each other.
What's the timeline of your project?
So we're just entering year 2, so about 3 to 4 years left on that, with the cultural exchange happening in a couple of years.
Wow. You mentioned the SAN. This was a place where Inuit children were brought with the tuberculosis scare back in the 40s, 50s, 60s. This was, I guess the thought process was, let's give them care, but they were taken from their homes as well, and this was very traumatic.
Inuit children and adults. So the Eastern Arctic Patrol, which was a ship, would travel up in the summer months. It had an X-ray machine on it and a medical staff, and so Inuit would be brought from the shore. They would be boated out to the ship, and they would have an x-ray done.
Okay.
If there was a concern or it was obvious that TB was present, they would not be allowed to leave the ship to say goodbye.
Wow.
And they would stay on the ship, and the ship would go to other communities and then eventually come back down south. And so some Inuit, Moose Factory in Northern Ontario is an important nexus point because a lot of people off the ship would go to Moose Factory, and they would be transferred to different sanatoria in southern Canada. And the one that had the largest Inuit population was right here in Hamilton. And so many came to Hamilton. There wasn't really a good social welfare kind of system in place in terms of some people didn't know where their families went. Some people didn't know when their family members were coming back.
Or if they would ever come back.
Right? And to that point, in Hamilton at Woodland Cemetery, there is a memorial that stands, and it's in honor of those who passed away during TB treatment here in Hamilton.
So I would guess that they had no idea that they would be taken from their families to be brought to...
Well, somewhat. I mean, it would become clear. It wasn't you're just coming, onto the boat and, but if you were positive or thought to be positive, you couldn't couldn't go back. And so some people, of course, would have known this because this was an annual thing that would happen, right?
Wow.
But there was not a lot of detailed information for every patient on where is this person going, will letters be sent out, updates, etc.
Wow.
Yeah.
That had to be a very, imagine just your child being brought onto this boat and you're never going to see them again. So traumatic.
It is. And it's a complicated history, right? Because as you say, we're talking about the treatment of a sickness. So helping people become well, right? Which is a positive thing generally, right? But this sort of systemic issue that was happening in the background and people leaving thousands of kilometers for an unknown amount of time has major impacts. Yeah.
Very sad. Art made by Inuit is a form of occupational therapy. You mentioned that. Are some of those items going to be as part of this cultural exchange? Yeah,
there will be opportunities for the students to go to the Art Gallery of Hamilton to see them. Absolutely. And even, I guess, maybe I could speak a bit to Hamiltonians for a moment here, if I could. But I had a really amazing experience this past summer where the goddaughter of the assistant medical superintendent in the 1950s heard about the project, and she lives in Sarnia. And so we were connected through someone we both knew in London. And she told me that she had 6 carvings that were purchased by her godfather and gifted to her as a child as Christmas gifts.
Wow.
And so I traveled to meet her, and we did some video work for a future digital story, but she gifted these 6 pieces to the project. And so right now we're going to be looking at how to facilitate their return to community. She was very clear she wanted these carvings to go back to the family members or the artists if they're still living.
Right.
And because we do have some access to the archival records, the patient records, here in Hamilton, we were able to confirm that every one of those, because names or E-numbers, as they were called, were carved into the bottom of these, and they were all patients at the SAN.
Wow.
Yeah, so right now we're in the midst of working that out.
And they were carved in so they know who at the time made them, because you mentioned some of them would get a little bit of money for it as well.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
Where was she keeping these items?
So she had them in her house. She had them out on display for quite a while. But then when the TRC was released in 2015 and she read through that, she felt that they needed to be put away.
Wow.
And so they were put away and very carefully taken care of within her home. And she brought them back out when our team came to visit her, and she gifted them. Yeah.
That is amazing.
And they're beautiful.
And how long has she had them for?
Well, she's had them for, I think, probably at least 50 to 60 years.
Wow.
Yep.
That is tremendous.
Yep.
And what kind of condition are they in?
They're in fairly good condition.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow,
and
that's
it's complicated because these are carvings that were done by people who were sick.
Right.
Who were sick.
Yeah.
Right? And so when you think about the complications around art being beautiful, right, but also made at a time as a form of therapy, but then also sold at a hospital gift shop, which is making a profit from that.
Right.
Right? And it's a very complicated thing. So I guess if there are people listening, I mean, I would want to say for any Hamiltonians out there who either worked at the SAN or who had family members work at the SAN, or they themselves have inherited carvings like this or any art done by former patients of the SAN, please feel free to reach out to me and just to talk, just to have a conversation about your connection, right? Your connection with the SAN or your family's connection with the SAN.
What's the best way for them to do that?
So they can email me, and you can Google my name, but it's Watts V, WATTSV, at McMaster.ca, and I would love to hear from you and have a conversation with you.
That's tremendous. Wow. Who knows? You might see many more of these.
Yeah. And that would be amazing, because when we did go to Iqaluit and we were talking to survivors of the SAN, family members of former patients, they would talk about the art. And they really wanted to connect with the art, to touch the art, to see the art that is here at the Art Gallery of Hamilton. And so that became a real priority for us, is let's get the art up north. And there's complications around that too, because in terms of who owns art, right? Or who owns art when it has been created from a place of sickness or healing even. Maybe people it actually helped them in their healing journey. There's a lot of questions around and complications around that, but we do see this as an opportunity to at least reconnect people with those pieces physically.
Could this be a traveling exhibit that goes to Indigenous and non-Indigenous places?
I mean, it could be. We're really trying to be led by Inuit communities and organizations and what they see as the priority, especially the artists, right? And their families and what they see as important. So right now they are only at Indigenous museums, which will be Woodland and up north in Iqaluit, and we'll have to see what happens after that. But we're really trying to guide the research project by the priorities of Haudenosaunee and Inuit.
When you first looked at these artifacts, what was going through your mind?
I was a mixture of just feeling overwhelmed by the beauty of them and sadness too.
Sadness because of the story that's attached to it.
Because of the story that's attached to them, and a sort of desire and need to say these are really important pieces of history and cultural history, Inuit history, history in terms of Hamilton and what was happening in Hamilton in the 1950s and 60s. That connects people in Hamilton too, because a lot of people do know about the SAN, about the TB sanatorium, right? But they may not all know about this particular history, right? So I think it held a lot of gravity. And for me, as an Indigenous researcher, a good weight in terms of responsibility, feeling like, okay, like this is something that I can find a real purpose in terms of reconnecting these pieces with community, that this is going to be really important for me, but a good weight.
Yeah, that's tremendous. In closing, as we get set to commemorate the latest Truth and Reconciliation Day, what are you hopeful for?
I'm hopeful for, like I said before, the emergence of the residential school denialism. I'm hoping for people that might be in that camp to sort of sit back and listen, to just listen, to not speak out against, but just really listen. I think creating space for survivors to speak means that space has to be one of support, right? One that is a sort of somber moment for them, that we understand the gravity of the situation. So I think listening is really important. Truth cannot be told or heard without listeners, right? And we can be those listeners. And that is going to be one of the most important parts of healing, I think, is giving that space and that love and that support. Yeah.
Well said. And thank you so much for sharing your story and the story of others with us today.
Thank you so much.
That is Dr. Watts. And thank you for checking out the Newsmakers podcast. A big thank you to the all-star cast behind the scenes as well. If you like today's episode, click the thumbs up, hit subscribe, and leave a comment. You can catch the Newsmakers podcast on chch.com/podcasts and wherever you get your favorite podcasts.